The sound of shattering crystal pierced the formal dining room. My son David cried out in horror as his wife Rachel stood with her arm still extended, the follow-through of her violent gesture hanging in the air between us. Blood began to trickle down my temple, warm and insistent. "You worthless old hag," Rachel hissed, swaying drunkenly in my meticulously arranged dining room. "When I ask you for more wine, you obey." In that moment, something inside me, something that had been bending for months, finally snapped. Not toward anger or fear, but toward clarity. 30 years as a federal criminal judge had taught me to recognize a decisive moment when I saw one. I'd sentenced murderers, embezzlers, and con artists with less venom in their eyes than what I now saw in my daughter-in-law's gaze. I dabbed at my temple with my napkin, the crisp white linen now stained crimson. The room fell silent except for Rachel's heavy breathing and the gentle tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, a wedding gift from Richard, my late husband. That clock had witnessed 42 years of my life. Now it was witness to something else entirely. "Go to your room, Rachel," I said, my voice steady despite the shock. "David, please take your wife upstairs." My son's face had drained of all color. He looked like a boy again, the same expression he'd worn at 12 when he'd broken his arm falling from the oak tree in our backyard. But he wasn't a boy anymore. He was a 34-year-old veterinarian who had somehow married a hurricane disguised as a woman. David gently took Rachel's elbow. "Come on, honey. You've had too much to drink." Rachel yanked her arm away, nearly losing her balance. "Don't tell me what to do. This is all her fault," she spat, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "Always judging, always watching with those cold eyes. You think you're still in your courtroom, don't you, Margaret?" I said nothing, merely folding my napkin with deliberate precision and placing it beside my barely touched plate. The roast beef I'd spent hours preparing sat cooling on the table, the candlelight dancing across the scene like some macabre dinner theater. Eventually, David managed to guide Rachel from the room, her stream of invectives fading as they ascended the stairs. The door to their bedroom slammed hard enough to rattle the family photographs lining the hallway wall. Photographs that showed happier times before David's smile had grown so strained. I remained seated motionless for several minutes. Blood continued to seep from my temple, but I made no move to staunch it further. Instead, I mentally cataloged the evening's events with the methodical precision that had served me well during my 3 decades on the federal bench. The dinner had begun normally enough, or at least what passed for normal these 6 months since David and Rachel had moved into my home supposedly to save money for their own place. 6 months that had stretched my patience and my hospitality to breaking point. I'd prepared prime rib, David's favorite since childhood. I'd set the table with my grandmother's Waterford crystal and the bone china that Richard and I had received as wedding gifts. These small formalities mattered to me. After years of maintaining decorum in a courtroom ritual and order kept me anchored. Rachel had arrived home from work already agitated, tossing her designer purse onto the sofa and heading straight for the bar cart in the corner of the living room. She'd poured herself a generous glass of Cabernet while complaining about her boss. "That idiot made me redo the entire quarterly report because he said critical details were missing," as if he'd know a critical detail if it bit him on his fat ass. She'd drained her glass in 3 large gulps and refilled it before even sitting down at the table. David had shot me an apologetic look as he helped bring the food to the table, his eyes pleading for my understanding. Always the peacemaker, my son. Always trying to smooth rough edges, even when those edges cut him deeper with each passing day. During dinner, I tried to maintain civilized conversation, asking about David's day at the veterinary clinic, mentioning a book I was reading for my monthly book club, anything to dilute the tension Rachel carried with her like a second skin. But with every attempt at normalcy, Rachel had either interrupted with a cynical comment or rolled her eyes like a petulant teenager, not the 32-year-old financial analyst she purported to be. And with every interruption, she'd drunk more wine. By the 3rd bottle, I decided that enough was enough. When Rachel had held out her empty glass in my direction as if I were a waitress rather than the homeowner and her mother-in-law, I'd simply said, "I think you've had enough for tonight, Rachel." She'd frozen glass, still raised eyes narrowing as if she couldn't believe what she'd heard. "What did you say?" "I said you've had enough. This is my house, and I will not allow this level of intoxication at my table." It was like lighting a fuse. Her face had flushed, not just from the wine, but from a sudden fury that seemed to have been lurking beneath the surface for months. "Your house?" She'd laughed a bitter sound that sliced through the air. "Just because we have to live in this old museum with you doesn't mean you can treat us like children." David had touched her arm. "Rachel, please." She'd shaken him off. "No, David, I'm tired of this. Your mother looks at us like we're intruders, like we're not worthy to walk on her precious hardwood floors. She'd turned back to me, wine sloshing over the rim of her glass. You know what your problem is? You can't accept that you're no longer the powerful Judge Margaret Sullivan. Now you're just a lonely retired old woman who needs to control everything and everyone around her to feel important. I'd remained calm. Years in the courtroom had taught me not to react when provoked. If that's how you feel, perhaps it's time for you to find somewhere else to live. Mom, David had exclaimed, horrified. Rachel had smiled this kind of smile that never reaches the eyes. Servants shouldn't talk like that to their superiors. She'd held out her glass again. Now more wine? No. That was all it had taken. In a movement too fast for me to react, Rachel had thrown the glass directly at my face. The crystal had hit my right temple and shattered. I'd felt the sharp sting of the impact, then the warm trickle of blood down my cheek. Now as I finally rose from the dining table, my legs felt strangely steady beneath me. I walked to the bathroom off the kitchen and examined my reflection in the mirror. The cut wasn't deep, but head wounds always bled dramatically. I cleaned it methodically with antiseptic from the first aid kit under the sink, applying a small butterfly bandage. 30 years sending criminals to prison, and now I was bleeding in my own home. The irony wasn't lost on me. I returned to the dining room and began to clean up with deliberate care. I photographed the scene with my phone, the shattered glass, the blood spots on the tablecloth, the wine stain on my ivory blouse. Then I collected every fragment of crystal, placing them in a plastic bag, which I labeled with a marker, Exhibit A. Evidence. 30 years in the justice system had taught me that evidence was everything. That night, sleep eluded me. Sitting in my home office with an ice pack against my temple, I began to outline my strategy. Not for revenge was emotional, impulsive. What I needed was justice. I needed to protect my son and my home. The night had a strange clarity to it, the kind that comes only in those moments when a decision has been made and there's no turning back. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, and I picked up my phone. My fingers paused only briefly before dialing. Boston Police Department. How can I help you? I want to report an assault. Officer Peterson arrived at 7:30 a.m. as the morning sun began to filter through the curtains. Rachel and David were still sleeping upstairs, exhausted after the previous night's explosion. I opened the door, and the officer introduced himself, a middle-aged man with steel-gray hair at his temples, his posture military straight. Good morning, ma'am. I received a call about an assault. I invited him in and led him to the dining room where the pieces of crystal were still preserved in the corner, marked with small numbered labels I'd prepared during my sleepless hours. It happened here, I explained, keeping my voice low so as not to wake the two upstairs. My daughter-in-law threw this glass at my face when I refused to serve her more wine. She had already consumed too much alcohol. I showed him the photos on my phone, the cut on my temple, now sporting an impressive bruise, the blood on my blouse, the shattered glass. Officer Peterson wrote everything down with a professional, non-judgmental expression. Is the alleged assailant still in the residence? Yes, sleeping upstairs with my son. Do you wish to file a formal complaint? I hesitated only for a second, thinking of David, but then remembered Rachel's expression as she threw the glass, that certainty that she could assault me in my own house and face no consequences. Yes, officer, I do. He nodded, continuing to write in his notebook. May I ask about your relationship with your daughter-in-law? Has there been any previous violence or threats? This is the first physical assault, but there has been escalating verbal aggression since they moved in 6 months ago. I paused, choosing my words carefully. I was a federal criminal judge for 30 years, Officer Peterson. I understand the gravity of filing a formal complaint, and I wouldn't do so without due consideration. Something shifted in his expression, a new respect, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit in the justice system. I see. In that case, Judge Sullivan, I'll need to take your formal statement. Then we'll need to speak with your daughter-in-law. As he was taking my statement, we heard movement upstairs, the creak of floorboards, the sound of a door opening. I tensed, bracing myself for what would come next. David appeared first, dressed in yesterday's clothes, his face haggard from lack of sleep. He froze at the sight of the police officer sitting at our dining room table. Mom, what's going on? Before I could answer, Rachel appeared behind him wearing silk pajamas and a silk robe that cost more than most people's weekly salary. Her face was puffy from sleep and alcohol, but her eyes sharpened instantly upon seeing Officer Peterson. What the hell is this? She demanded, her voice still raspy from sleep. Officer Peterson stood, assuming a neutral professional stance. Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Officer Peterson with the Boston Police Department. I'm here regarding an incident that occurred last night involving an assault on your mother-in-law. I'd like to ask you some questions." Rachel's face performed a remarkable transformation from shock to anger to a calculated calm in the span of seconds. "There must be some misunderstanding. We had a small disagreement last night, that's all. A family matter." "Mom, what are you doing?" David looked at me, betrayal etched across his features. I met my son's gaze steadily. "What would you have done, David, if I had thrown a glass at Rachel's face? Would that have been just a family matter, too?" He flinched as if I'd slapped him. Rachel turned to him, her voice suddenly soft, vulnerable. "David, please tell them this is all a misunderstanding. You know I would never intentionally hurt Margaret." I watched my son's face, saw the conflict there, the desperate desire to believe his wife's version of events. But there was doubt, too. He had witnessed what happened after all. Officer Rachel continued, assuming a tone of reasoned concern. "Margaret has been under a lot of stress lately. Retirement has been difficult for her. Sometimes she exaggerates things, imagines slights where none exist. I'm worried about her, honestly." My blood boiled at the transparent attempt to paint me as a confused, possibly senile old woman, but I kept my expression neutral. Evidence would speak louder than emotion. "Mrs. Sullivan," Officer Peterson addressed Rachel, "Judge Sullivan has provided photographic evidence of her injury, the weapon used, and the scene. She has also filed a formal complaint. I need to ask you about the events of last night." Rachel's facade cracked slightly. "Judge Sullivan, what are you talking about?" "Your mother-in-law was a federal criminal judge for 30 years before her retirement." Officer Peterson explained, a hint of satisfaction in his tone. "Now about last night." "I want a lawyer," Rachel interrupted, crossing her arms. "I'm not saying anything else without legal representation." "That's certainly your right," Officer Peterson acknowledged. "However, based on the evidence and testimony I've gathered, I am placing you under arrest for assault and battery. You have the right to remain silent." As he continued reading Rachel her rights, her face drained of color. David stood frozen, looking between his wife and mother, as if he couldn't quite process what was happening. When Officer Peterson finished, Rachel turned to David, tears now flowing freely. "Are you going to let this happen? Your own mother is having me arrested over an accident. David, please." My son looked utterly lost. "Rachel, you threw a glass at my mother's face. I saw you. It wasn't an accident. It was the wine talking, not me. You know, I'd never do something like that sober. I've been under so much pressure at work. Please, David, don't let them take me." Officer Peterson interrupted gently but firmly. "Sir, I need to take your wife to the station for booking. You're welcome to follow and arrange for an attorney." "This is insane," Rachel hissed, turning her fury back to me as Officer Peterson prepared to escort her out. "You'll regret this, Margaret. You have no idea who you're messing with." As Peterson led her toward the door, Rachel suddenly lunged toward me, finger pointed accusingly. "You've always hated me. You've been trying to come between us from day one." Officer Peterson firmly restrained her, maintaining professional composure. "That's enough, Mrs. Sullivan. Let's go." After they left, David and I stood in terrible silence. The grandfather clock ticked loudly in the vacuum they'd left behind. "How could you?" David finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How could I not?" I countered. "David, look at what she did." I gestured to my injured temple. "This isn't normal. This isn't acceptable. Not in anyone's home, but especially not in mine." "You could have talked to me first," he said, anger beginning to seep into his tone. "We could have handled this as a family, like we've been handling Rachel's behavior for the past 6 months. I shook my head. "No, David. Some lines cannot be crossed. Physical violence is one of them. She's my wife, and I'm your mother. More importantly, I'm a human being who deserves basic respect and safety in her own home." David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache. He'd done the same thing as a little boy when upset or confused. "I need to go to the station. I need to help Rachel." "Of course you do," I said, not unkindly. "She's your wife and she needs help, real help, David. Not enabling, not excuses." He grabbed his keys and wallet, not meeting my eyes. "Don't wait up." After he left, I sank onto the sofa, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried me through the morning ebbed away, leaving me hollow. I touched the bandage on my temple, wincing slightly at the tenderness. The house felt oppressively quiet. I'd lived alone for 5 years since Richard's death, but this silence felt different, heavier, laden with consequences yet to unfold. I wondered if David would ever forgive me. I wondered if I'd just lost my son. But deep down, beneath the doubt and the pain, I knew I'd done the right thing. Sometimes the hardest choices were the most necessary ones. Richard had always said that about my most difficult cases, the ones where justice and mercy seemed at odds, where there were no easy answers, only right ones. You can't control how people react to the truth, Maggie, he'd told me once. You can only control whether you stand by it. I stood by my truth, now come what may. The hours crawled by as I waited for David's return. I tried to read but couldn't focus. I tried to eat but had no appetite. Eventually, I found myself in my home office, seated at the desk where I'd worked on countless cases over the years. Almost automatically, I began to review the events of the last 6 months with Rachel and David living in my home. There had been small things at first, Rachel's growing rudeness, her increasingly expensive shopping habits, despite their supposed goal of saving money, her subtle put-downs whenever David accomplished something. I dismissed these as the normal tensions of different generations living under one roof. But looking back with clearer eyes, I could see a pattern forming. David called around 4 in the afternoon. His voice sounded strained formal. Rachel's being charged with assault and battery. The DA is considering it domestic violence since we all live together. A pause. Her bail is set at $5,000. I'm arranging it now. I see, I said, keeping my voice neutral. She's got a lawyer. She says she's going to fight this. Says it's all a misunderstanding. Another pause. Mom, can't you just drop the charges for me? A familiar weight settled in my chest, the burden of being the one to hold the line when everyone else wanted to take the easy way out. No, David, I can't. What Rachel did was assault. There have to be consequences. She's my wife, he repeated as if that explained everything, excused everything. And that's why you need to think very carefully about what happened last night. About what's been happening for months. What's that supposed to mean? It means open your eyes, son. Rachel has been manipulating you, manipulating us both from the beginning. He hung up without another word. I placed the phone down gently, fighting back tears. This was the part they never warned you about when you became a parent, that sometimes doing the right thing for your child meant being the villain in their story, at least for a while. Rachel returned home with David that evening. I heard them come in, heard their hushed, intense conversation in the foyer. Then footsteps on the stairs, a bedroom door closing. I remained in my office, giving them space, wondering what came next. The following morning, I rose early as was my habit. To my surprise, David was already in the kitchen making coffee. He looked terrible, eyes bloodshot, hair uncombed, still wearing yesterday's clothes. She's not supposed to be here, he said without preamble. There's a no-contact order as part of her bail conditions. She has to find somewhere else to stay until the hearing. I nodded unsurprised. I see. I'll be going with her, he added, not meeting my eyes. We'll get a hotel room until we figure something out. I felt a pang of loss but kept my expression neutral. That's your choice, David. He finally looked at me, anger and hurt warring in his eyes. You didn't have to do this. You could have given her another chance. Like the dozens of chances we've already given her to treat us with basic respect. I poured myself a cup of coffee, my hands steady despite the emotion churning inside. David, I spent 30 years watching people make excuses for those who harm them. It never ends well. Rachel doesn't harm me, he scoffed. You make her sound like some kind of abuser. I sipped my coffee, choosing my words carefully. What would you call someone who isolates you from friends and family, belittles your accomplishments, controls your finances, and now has escalated to physical violence in your home? He flinched. It's not like that. You don't understand our relationship. Perhaps not, but I understand patterns of behavior, and Rachel's pattern is concerning. David slammed his coffee cup down, liquid sloshing over the rim. This is exactly why we're leaving. You've never given her a chance. You've always judged her, always found her wanting. That's not true, and you know it, I replied, keeping my voice level. I welcomed you both into my home. I've overlooked countless incidents of disrespect and unkindness, but I draw the line at physical violence. He shook his head, already turning away. We'll be gone within the hour. True to his word, David and Rachel left 45 minutes later. He didn't say goodbye. Rachel, for her part, shot me a look of pure venom as she swept past me to the car. It was a look I'd seen many times before in my courtroom on the faces of defendants who believed themselves above the law, above consequences. It was the look of someone who would not stop until they got what they wanted. After they'd gone, I called Victoria Chen, an attorney who had argued many cases in my courtroom over the years, and who had become a friend after my retirement. I explained the situation and she agreed to meet me for lunch. Victoria was in her 50s, a sharp-minded litigator with a specialty in family law and domestic violence cases. We met at a quiet restaurant downtown away from my neighborhood where gossip might spread. So your daughter-in-law assaulted you, And now your son has moved out with her in solidarity," Victoria summarized after I'd relayed the events. "Margaret, I'm so sorry." "I'm less concerned about myself than about David," I admitted. "There's something not right about their relationship, Victoria. Something beyond normal marital ups and downs." Victoria nodded thoughtfully. "From what you've described, there are certainly red flags. The isolation, the financial control despite her supposedly high-paying job, the verbal aggression that's now escalated to physical violence." "Exactly. And there's something else that's been bothering me." I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "They moved in 6 months ago to save money for their own place. David makes a good living as a veterinarian. Rachel is supposedly a financial analyst making 6 figures. Where is all their money going?" Victoria's eyebrows raised. "That's a very good question. One that might be worth investigating. How would I go about doing that without overstepping? David already thinks I'm interfering too much." Victoria considered this, tapping her manicured nails against her water glass. "The assault case gives us some leverage. We could request financial records as part of the investigation, particularly if there's any indication that financial stress contributed to the incident." "Would that hold up?" "It might, especially given your background and connections." She gave me a meaningful look. "Judges tend to give considerable leeway to former judges." "I don't want special treatment, Victoria." "It's not about special treatment. It's about using every legal tool at our disposal to protect your son if he's in a potentially abusive relationship." I nodded slowly, a plan beginning to form. "What would you recommend as a first step?" "Let me file for a more comprehensive protective order. We'll include financial discovery as part of it. If Rachel's hiding something that might flush it out. And if David sees it as me escalating the situation." Victoria's expression softened. "Margaret, you can't save people who don't want to be saved, but you can make sure they have a safety net when they're ready. That's what you're building now, a safety net." I thought of David as a child learning to ride a bicycle. He'd refused training wheels, determined to do it the big kid way. I'd let him try, let him fall, but I'd always been there to brush him off and help him back on the bike. Some lessons could only be learned through experience. This seemed like one of those times. All I could do was be ready to catch him when he fell. Victoria and I parted with an action plan. She would file for the expanded protective order and begin the financial discovery process. I would document everything I could remember about Rachel's behavior over the past 6 months. Every inconsistency, every red flag I'd noticed but dismissed. As I drove home, a strange calm settled over me. The road ahead would be difficult, possibly painful, but it was necessary. Sometimes justice required difficult choices. Sometimes love did too. The house felt emptier than ever when I returned. I wandered from room to room, noticing the small traces David and Rachel had left behind: a coffee mug in the sink, a forgotten scarf draped over a chair, David's childhood books still lining the shelves in what had become their bedroom. In their haste to leave, they'd left several things behind. I began to gather these items, intending to pack them up for when David inevitably returned for them. In the guest bathroom, I found Rachel's cosmetics bag partially emptied, but with some items remaining: expensive creams and serums that promised eternal youth at exorbitant prices. As I placed these items in a box, I noticed something odd: a prescription bottle tucked behind the toiletries. It had David's name on it, but the medication wasn't one I recognized. Why would David keep his medication in Rachel's cosmetics bag? I examined the bottle more closely. The prescription was for alprazolam, commonly known as Xanax, prescribed for anxiety. But David had never mentioned anxiety issues, never taken medication for it in all the years I'd known him. And the dosage seemed unusually high. A chill ran through me as I recalled the night before the assault, when Rachel had insisted on making me tea, something she'd never done before. I'd found the gesture odd, but had accepted it as perhaps an olive branch. The tea had tasted bitter, but I'd attributed that to the herbal blend she'd used. I'd slept unusually deeply that night, almost groggily. Had I been drugged? And if so, to what end? I carefully placed the prescription bottle in a plastic bag and set it aside. Victoria would want to see this. It might be nothing, a legitimate prescription that David had simply never mentioned, or it might be something more sinister. Either way, it was evidence. And evidence, as I well knew, was the foundation of justice. That night, as I sat alone in my kitchen with a cup of tea, one I'd made myself, I reflected on how quickly life could change. A week ago, I had been a retired judge, living peacefully with my son and daughter-in-law, navigating the minor challenges of multi-generational living. Now I was alone again, injured, estranged from my only child, gathering evidence against my daughter-in-law like I was building a case for trial. Which in a way I was. The trial just wasn't happening in a courtroom, at least not yet. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, the sound echoing through the empty house. Richard had always wound that clock every Sunday without fail. After his death, I had taken over the ritual, finding comfort in the continuity, the precision. Some things could be relied upon even when everything else fell apart. Justice was like that too, I reflected. It didn't always arrive swiftly or painlessly, but it did arrive with the same measured certainty as the ticking of that grandfather clock. Tick by tick, piece by piece, the truth would emerge, and I would be ready when it did. Victoria Chen set a thick manila folder on the polished surface of her office desk. I've completed the initial investigation into Rachel's finances as you requested, Margaret. She flipped it open to reveal meticulously organized bank statements, credit reports, and property records. This isn't just financial mismanagement. What we're looking at is a pattern of deliberate, calculated fraud stretching back years before she even met David. The mid-morning sun filtered through Victoria's downtown office windows, illuminating dust motes that danced between us like tiny witnesses to this unfolding revelation. 2 weeks had passed since Rachel's arrest, and I'd spent every day building a case that grew more disturbing by the hour. I leaned forward, scanning the documents with practiced precision. Decades on the bench had taught me to find the story hidden within financial transactions, to see the narrative thread that connected seemingly disparate actions. What I saw in these papers made my blood run cold despite the warm May sunshine. Multiple accounts under variations of her name, I murmured, tracing a finger along a statement from a bank in Nevada. Monthly transfers of $5,000 dating back 14 months, nearly $70,000 that David likely knows nothing about. Victoria nodded, her expression grim. The money trail gets more concerning. I subpoenaed her employment records using the domestic violence angle. Rachel hasn't worked at Meridian Financial for the past 3 months, despite telling David she's received a promotion. A knot formed in my stomach. Where has she been going every day? That's unclear, but she's been paying the premium on a separate health insurance policy for herself, one that doesn't include David, and making regular payments to a divorce attorney in Cambridge. Victoria slid another document forward. And there's a life insurance policy taken out on you 6 months ago with Rachel as the sole beneficiary. The death benefit is $2 million. The room seemed to tilt slightly, the familiar sensation I'd experienced whenever a seemingly straightforward case in my courtroom suddenly revealed a more sinister dimension. She's been planning an exit strategy from the beginning. It appears so, and you may have been an obstacle to whatever she was planning. Victoria's expression softened. Have you heard from David? I shook my head, the ache of his absence a constant companion these days. He texts to confirm he's alive, but refuses to meet. The last message said he and Rachel are working through things, and that I need to respect their marriage. We need to get this information to him somehow. His wife isn't just volatile, she's potentially dangerous. I gathered the documents, carefully replacing them in the folder. I'll find a way. David may be angry with me, but he's not stupid. Evidence speaks for itself. The courthouse steps felt familiar beneath my feet as I left Victoria's office, though I hadn't ascended them professionally in 5 years. The weight of the folder in my hands reminded me of case files I'd carried into that building countless times, lives distilled into paper and ink waiting for judgment. Now it was my son's life contained in those pages, and the judgment would be his alone to make. I drove home with the windows down, hoping the fresh air might clear my head. The magnolia trees lining my street were in full bloom, their sweet fragrance at odds with the bitterness I carried within me. I'd planted those trees when David was just a boy, teaching him how to carefully pat down the soil around the delicate roots. You have to be gentle but firm, I'd told him. Give them enough room to grow, but make sure they're secure. Parenting advice disguised as gardening tips my specialty. I pulled into the driveway, noticing immediately that something was different. The curtains in the front windows had been adjusted not dramatically, but enough that my judicial attention to detail registered the change. Someone had been in my house. Caution overrode curiosity. I backed out of the driveway and parked a block away, then called Officer Peterson, who had handled Rachel's arrest. He arrived within 15 minutes, squad car lights off, at my request. You believe someone entered your home, Judge Sullivan? I know it. The curtains have been moved, and that lock, I pointed to the side door handle, has scratch marks it didn't have this morning. Peterson drew his weapon and approached cautiously while I remained by his patrol car. Minutes later, he emerged and gestured for me to join him. No one's here now, but someone definitely was. He led me through my own home, now transformed into a crime scene. Kitchen drawers were searched, your office was ransacked, and the bedroom has been thoroughly tossed. I surveyed the damage with growing dread. Papers scattered across the floor of my home office drawers, pulled open books removed from shelves. But it wasn't random vandalism. This was a search. They knew what they were looking for, I murmured, bending to retrieve a framed photo of David's graduation from veterinary school, its glass now cracked. The question is, did they find it? Peterson bagged several items for fingerprinting and took photographs of the scene. Any idea what they might have been after? I thought of the prescription bottle I'd found in Rachel's cosmetics bag, now locked in Victoria's office safe, along with copies of all the financial documents we'd gathered. Evidence, most likely. Proof of various irregularities I've been documenting. After Peterson left, promising to file the report and increase patrols in the area, I sat in my disheveled living room, too drained to begin the cleanup. The grandfather clock, miraculously untouched, chimed 4 times. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Back off if you know what's good for you and David." I took a screenshot and forwarded it to Victoria and Peterson before blocking the number. Intimidation tactics, the last resort of those who knew they were losing control of the narrative. I'd seen it countless times in my courtroom, and it had never once deterred me from pursuing justice. It wouldn't now, either. The next morning I awoke to a pounding on my front door. I'd slept poorly, jerking awake at every creak of the old house, settling my mind, replaying the violation of my home. Through the peephole, I saw David unshaven and haggard, shifting restlessly on the porch. I opened the door, heart racing with hope and apprehension. "Why didn't you tell me you were investigating Rachel?" He pushed past me into the house, stopping short at the sight of the disarray I'd only partially managed to clean up. "What happened here?" "Someone broke in yesterday. The police believe it was connected to the evidence I've been gathering about Rachel's activities." I closed the door, studying my son's face for signs of what he knew, what he believed. "How did you find out about the investigation?" David's laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. "Rachel showed me pictures of you meeting with her ex-husband's sister. She said you've been conspiring with her family to frame her. The absurdity of this claim might have been amusing under different circumstances." "I've never met any of Rachel's relatives. I didn't even know she'd been married before." His eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about? She told me her ex-husband's sister has been harassing her for years." "David," I said carefully, "according to the records I've seen, Rachel has been married twice before you. Neither ended well for the men involved." I could see the war within him, the need to defend his wife, battling against the seed of doubt my words had planted. He sank onto the sofa, suddenly looking every one of his 34 years and more. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he whispered, the fight draining out of him. "Last night I found her going through my phone while I was in the shower. When I asked why, she flew into a rage, accused me of hiding things from her. But I'm not the one with secrets." I sat beside him, close but not touching, respecting the fragile moment. "What kinds of secrets have you discovered?" "Credit card statements for accounts I never knew existed. Calls to numbers she won't explain. And last week I found a key to a storage unit I never knew we had." He rubbed his temples, a gesture so like his father it made my heart ache. "I'm a fool, aren't I?" I shook my head. "Not a fool. Just someone who wanted to believe the best about the person he loves. There's no shame in that." David looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, but clearer than I'd seen them in months. "I need to see what you found." I retrieved the copies I'd made of Victoria's files from my bedroom safe, concealed behind a portrait of Richard. As David pored over them at the dining room table, his expression cycled through disbelief, anger, and finally a resigned understanding. "She told me we were saving for a house," he said, voice flat, as he stared at the Nevada bank statements. "Every month I put $5,000 into our joint account for the down payment. She was supposed to match it. Instead, she was diverting her portion to this secret account." I placed my hand over his. "That's just the beginning, David. The life insurance policy on me, the consultations with divorce attorneys, the prescription drugs with your name on them found in her belongings, this goes beyond financial infidelity." His head snapped up. "What prescription drugs?" I showed him the photos I'd taken of the alprazolam bottle. "Have you been prescribed Xanax recently?" "No, never. I don't have anxiety issues." His face paled. "But Rachel has been making my tea every night for months. She said it was a special blend to help me sleep better after long days at the clinic." The implications hung heavy between us. I thought of my own bitter tea the night before the assault, my unusually deep sleep. "We should have these tested." I said, gesturing to the photos. "And you should see a doctor." Before David could respond, his phone buzzed with a text message. His expression hardened as he read it. "Rachel knows I'm here. She's threatening to harm herself if I don't come back immediately." He showed me the screen displaying a photo of Rachel holding a handful of pills. "This is the third time she's done this. Each time I suggest separation, she threatens suicide." Another manipulation tactic, one I'd seen destroy rational thought in even the strongest individuals. "That's emotional blackmail, David. It's another form of control." "I know." He stood gathering the documents with trembling hands. "But what if she really does it? How do I live with that?" I understood his fear, the impossible weight of feeling responsible for another's life choices, but I also recognized the trap Rachel had so expertly laid. "If you're truly concerned, call for a welfare check. The police can ensure her safety without you having to rush back into a dangerous situation." I squeezed his shoulder gently. "You can't save someone by drowning with them, David." He nodded slowly, the wisdom of this settling over him like a mantle of newfound strength. He called the local police, calmly explaining the situation and requesting they check on Rachel at the hotel. Then he turned back to me. "I need to go to the bank. If she's been planning to leave, she might try to empty our accounts now that she knows I'm on to her." "I'll come with you," I offered, grabbing my purse. "And afterward, we should visit Victoria. She can help you understand your legal options." We drove to the bank in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. I stole glances at my son's profile, so like Richard's, the determined set of his jaw, the thoughtful furrow of his brow. He was finding his way back to himself, painful step by painful step. At the bank, David's fears proved well-founded. Rachel had attempted to withdraw $50,000 from their joint account that morning, but had been delayed by the bank's policy requiring notice for large cash withdrawals. The account was now frozen pending David's review. She told the teller she was buying a car as a surprise for her husband. The bank manager explained, clearly uncomfortable. But given the amount and her agitation when told about the waiting period, we flagged the transaction. David's laugh held no humor. The only surprise would have been coming home to an empty account. By the time we reached Victoria's office, David had moved beyond shock into a quiet, focused anger, the kind that fueled clear thinking rather than clouding it. Victoria laid out his options without sugarcoating the difficulties ahead. "Given what we know, you have grounds for both criminal charges and a divorce. The financial fraud is documented. The potential drugging is concerning, but would require toxicology testing to prove. And if I decide to press charges," Victoria glanced at me, then back to David, "it would mean testifying against Rachel, potentially exposing financial details in open court. But it would also create a record that might protect others from similar exploitation in the future." David nodded, absorbing this. "What would Mom have to do?" Margaret's assault case would proceed separately, though they could potentially be joined if the prosecution sees them as part of the same pattern of behavior. Victoria leaned forward. "The decision to pursue criminal charges is entirely yours, David, but the divorce that I strongly recommend regardless." He stared out the window for a long moment, watching pedestrians flow along the sidewalk below, each immersed in their own life's drama. "I need to see the storage unit first. I want the complete picture before I decide." We drove across town to the storage facility Rachel had been paying for secretly. David used the key he'd found to open a small unit at the back of the complex. Inside was a collection of designer luggage, a locked fireproof safe, and several boxes labeled with unfamiliar names. "These aren't our things," David murmured, examining a box marked M. Kaufman Personal. "I don't know who M. Kaufman is." With the facility manager's permission, we opened the safe using the facility's override key. Inside were multiple passports with Rachel's photo, but different names, bundles of cash in various currencies, and a thumb drive. My judicial instincts flared. "We need to call Officer Peterson. This goes beyond marital discord." While waiting for the police to arrive, David sorted through the box labeled Kaufman. His face grew increasingly pale as he examined its contents, photos of an older man with Rachel Property Deeds bank statements. "I think this was one of her previous husbands," he said, holding up a wedding photo. "She looks younger, her hair is different, but it's definitely Rachel." He rifled through more papers. According to these documents, Martin Kaufman died 3 years ago, just 6 months after their wedding. Heart failure. The facility manager, hovering nervously nearby, cleared his throat. "The woman who rented this unit, she wasn't going by Rachel Sullivan. She used the name Emily Kaufman. David looked up sharply. That's not possible. Rachel's maiden name is Taylor. Rachel Taylor. The manager shrugged apologetically. All I know is she showed ID as Emily Kaufman when she rented the unit last year. When Officer Peterson arrived with his partner, the scope of the investigation expanded dramatically. The thumb drive contained folders meticulously labeled with men's names, 7 in total, including David S. Each contained detailed information about the man's finances, family relationships, daily routines, and vulnerabilities. This isn't just fraud, Peterson said, scrolling through the files. This looks like a long-term pattern of targeting men for financial exploitation. We'll need digital forensics to go through this thoroughly. As the police documented and collected the evidence, David stood apart, arms wrapped around himself, as though physically holding his world together. I joined him, offering silent support. I don't even know who she is, he whispered. I've been living with a complete stranger. The woman David had married, had loved, had defended against his own mother's concerns, was a phantom, a carefully constructed persona designed to separate him from his money, and possibly worse. The realization was a blow more devastating than any physical assault could have been. What happens now? He asked, watching as officers cataloged his unraveling marriage in evidence bags and photographs. Now we let the justice system do its work. I answered, the familiar weight of that system a comfort after so much uncertainty. And you begin to rebuild. The days that followed brought a flurry of activity. Rachel was arrested again, this time on fraud charges related to the storage unit findings. When the police searched the hotel room, they discovered printouts of my daily routine research on undetectable poisons and drafts of suicide notes in David's handwriting, forged but convincing. The district attorney's office, presented with the mounting evidence, upgraded the charges to include attempted murder and conspiracy. Rachel's bail was revoked, and she remained in custody pending trial. David moved back home, temporarily occupying his old bedroom like a shipwreck survivor washing up on familiar shores. His grief manifested physically: weight loss, insomnia, a haunted look that didn't fade even when he smiled. But beneath the pain, I glimpsed something else emerging: resilience. One evening, about a week after the storage unit discovery, I found him sitting in the garden, staring at the magnolia trees in the fading light. I joined him on the bench, listening to the distant sounds of neighborhood life children playing dinner preparations, lawn sprinklers hissing gentle arcs across manicured grass. I keep thinking about the first time I met her, he said without preamble. At that charity gala for the animal shelter. She seemed so passionate about the cause, so genuine in her concern for abandoned pets. Was that all an act too? Did she research me, target me specifically? According to the evidence on the thumb drive, that's exactly what had happened. Rachel, or whatever her real name was, had identified David as a potential mark months before engineering their chance meeting. His stable income, inherited trust fund from his grandfather, and connection to me, a retired judge with significant assets, had made him an ideal target. But there was no kindness in confirming his worst fears. Does it matter now? I asked instead. Whether she chose you randomly or specifically, the deception was the same. The question is what you do with that knowledge moving forward. He nodded slowly. I've been so angry at her, at myself for being so blind, even at you for being right about her. He turned to face me fully. But mostly I'm angry because I still miss her sometimes. Or at least the person I thought she was. How messed up is that? It wasn't messed up at all. It was profoundly human to mourn not just what was, but what might have been the future he'd imagined, now permanently foreclosed. The heart doesn't heal in a straight line. I told him echoing words Richard had once offered me after a particularly difficult case had left me questioning my judicial objectivity. Some days you'll move forward, others you'll slide back. Eventually the forward days outnumber the backward ones. He managed a small, genuine smile, the first I'd seen in weeks. When did you get so wise, Mom? Around the same time my hair turned gray. I bumped his shoulder gently with mine. Comes with the territory. We sat in companionable silence until the fireflies began to emerge, their intermittent glow punctuating the gathering darkness like Morse code signals of life, continuing, adapting, persisting. The next morning, Victoria called with news that shifted the case into even more serious territory. The police had matched Rachel's fingerprints to those of Elaine Porter, wanted in connection with the suspicious deaths of 2 former husbands in Arizona and Florida. They're exhuming Martin Kaufman's body for toxicology testing, Victoria explained. And they've identified at least 4 other aliases she's used over the past decade. This is now a multi-state federal investigation. David took the news with a strange calm, as though having his worst suspicions confirmed was almost a relief compared to the uncertainty. So I could have been husband number 3 to die mysteriously. It's looking that way, Victoria acknowledged. The FBI agent I spoke with believes you and Margaret were saved by the wine glass incident. It forced her hand before she could complete whatever she had planned. A broken wine glass had potentially saved both our lives. The random chaos of that moment, Rachel's drunken rage, my refusal to be intimidated, the shattering crystal had derailed a carefully orchestrated scheme years in the making. Sometimes justice arrived in unexpected packages. David spent the day making calls to his bank, his attorney, his closest friends who had distanced themselves during his marriage. With each conversation, he reclaimed another piece of his life, his identity. That evening, he cooked dinner for us, both a simple pasta dish, but the first time he'd shown interest in food in weeks. As we ate, he unveiled a decision that caught me by surprise. "I've been offered a position at a veterinary hospital in Worcester," he said, twirling spaghetti around his fork. "It's a good opportunity, better salary, more responsibility, chance to develop my interest in exotic animal medicine." My heart sank at the thought of him moving even an hour away, but I kept my expression neutral. "That sounds wonderful. When would you start now?" "Not for a couple of months. There's too much to handle here first. The divorce, the criminal proceedings, selling the condo Rachel and I bought." He set down his fork, meeting my gaze directly. "But I think a fresh start would be good. Too many ghosts in Boston." I understood all too well the need to create distance from painful associations. After Richard died, I'd redecorated our bedroom, unable to sleep, surrounded by our shared belongings. Sometimes healing required physical relocation. "Worcester isn't so far," I offered, trying to sound supportive rather than bereft. "We can still see each other regularly." David reached across the table, covering my hand with his. "Actually, I was hoping you might consider moving too. Not to the same neighborhood or anything weird," he added hastily, "but maybe to the same city. The housing market in Worcester is more reasonable than Boston. You could get a nice place with the money from selling this house." The suggestion left me momentarily speechless. I'd lived in this house for over 3 decades. It contained the physical history of my life with Richard of David's childhood. But it also now held darker memories, the assault, the break-in, the knowledge that someone had plotted my death within these walls. "I hadn't considered moving," I admitted. "This house has always been home." "Just think about it," he urged. "It doesn't have to be Worcester specifically, but maybe a change would be good for both of us." I promised to consider it, turning the idea over in my mind as we finished dinner. There was wisdom in his suggestion, though it would be a significant upheaval at my age. But then I'd never been one to shy away from difficult transitions. My entire career had been built on navigating complex change with grace and precision. The following week brought David's first appearance in divorce court. Rachel, now officially identified as Elaine Porter, appeared in prisoner's overalls. Her previous glamour dimmed by institutional lighting and the absence of expensive cosmetics. She didn't look at David once during the proceedings, her gaze fixed straight ahead, as though already focusing on her next performance, her next identity. The judge granted an emergency dissolution, given the criminal charges, bypassing the usual waiting period. David emerged from the courtroom legally single again, the 10-month marriage erased with the stroke of a pen. "That's it?" he asked as we walked down the courthouse steps. "It feels so anticlimactic." "The legal severing of ties often is," I replied, having witnessed countless divorces during my time on the bench. "It's the emotional untangling that takes longer." He nodded, loosening his tie as we reached the sidewalk. The late June sun beat down on the concrete, creating heat mirages that rippled the air above the pavement. "At least it's done. Legally, anyway." That evening, David mentioned he'd been researching support groups for victims of relationship fraud. "There's one that meets at the community center downtown. I'm thinking of checking it out." I encouraged him, recognizing the healing potential in shared experience. "It might help to talk with others who understand what you've been through." "That's what I thought too." He hesitated, fidgeting with his water glass. "Actually, there's something I've been wanting to tell you. I've started seeing someone professionally, a therapist. She specializes in trauma and betrayal." A wave of relief and pride washed through me. "I think that's an excellent decision." It was scary making that first appointment, admitting I needed help. He smiled ruefully. But you raised me to face difficult things head-on, remember? I remembered all too well the countless conversations about integrity, about doing what was right rather than what was easy. Those lessons had shaped him, formed the foundation of his character, despite Rachel's attempts to undermine it. I'm proud of you, David. Not just for seeking help, but for everything you've done these past few weeks. Many people would have crumbled under the weight of such betrayal. He shrugged off the praise, uncomfortable as always, with direct compliments. I had a good example. You've never run from a fight in your life. Not running from fights had defined much of my career, my approach to parenting, my very worldview. Stand firm, face the truth, do what's right. These principles had guided me through decades of complex decisions, both on and off the bench. They would guide us through this crucible as well, forging something stronger from the broken pieces Rachel had left in her wake. The next day, I visited Victoria's office to finalize some paperwork related to the assault case. The district attorney had agreed to fold it into the larger federal case against Rachel Elaine, sparing me a separate trial. They've identified 2 more victims still living, Victoria informed me as we reviewed the documents. Men who were involved with Elaine but escaped before marriage. Both reported similar patterns: love bombing followed by isolation, financial control, and finally mysterious health issues that began once she had access to their finances. Will they testify? One has agreed to. The other is still too traumatized, according to the prosecutor. Victoria closed the file with a decisive snap. The case against her is solid regardless. Financial fraud alone carries significant penalties. Add the attempted murder charges and she's looking at decades behind bars. The knowledge should have brought satisfaction, but instead I felt only a profound sadness for all the lives this woman had damaged, including her own. What series of events had created someone capable of such calculated cruelty? What wounds had never healed, festering instead into this pattern of destruction? As a judge, I'd always tried to see the humanity in even the most hardened defendants. Not to excuse their actions, but to understand the complex interplay of choice and circumstance that led them to my courtroom. What makes someone become like that? I wondered aloud. Capable of such sustained deception, such disregard for others. Victoria shook her head. That's above my pay grade. But the prosecutor mentioned they're having her evaluated psychiatrically. Sociopathy, narcissistic personality disorder, labels that explain the behavior without excusing it. Labels might help the courts determine appropriate sentencing, but they did little to heal the damage left behind. That harder work fell to those of us picking up the pieces, David rebuilding his trust in others, me reconciling the violation of my home and safety, both of us learning to recognize the warning signs we'd missed before. As I drove home, I passed the community center where David would be attending his support group that evening. On impulse, I pulled into the parking lot and sat for a moment watching people enter the building, ordinary men and women carrying invisible burdens, seeking connection through shared pain. There was courage in that simple act, acknowledging wounds, reaching for healing, refusing to let tragedy have the final word. David's courage, and perhaps in time my own as well. The courtroom fell silent as Elaine Porter entered in her orange prison jumpsuit, handcuffed and escorted by 2 officers. It had been 3 months since the storage unit discovery, and today marked the beginning of her trial. I sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, my back straight, face composed the same judicial posture I'd maintained for 3 decades. Only now I occupied a different position in the room. David sat beside me, his shoulders no longer hunched with shame, but squared with resolve. The preliminary hearings had been difficult, each revelation about Elaine's past crimes, peeling away another layer of the woman he thought he had married. But today was different. Today we would hear her speak for the first time since her arrest, as she had finally agreed to a plea deal after the overwhelming evidence made trial a futile exercise. The judge, Harold Brennan, a colleague I had known for years, entered and called the court to order. The proceedings moved with the familiar rhythm of legal formality. Charges read rights, confirmed attorneys stating their appearances for the record. Then came the moment we had been waiting for. Mrs. Porter, do you understand the charges against you? Judge Brennan's voice carried the weight of authority I recognized intimately. Elaine's voice emerged surprisingly clear, devoid of emotion. Yes, Your Honor. And how do you plead? Guilty, Your Honor, as per the agreement with the prosecution. A barely perceptible ripple moved through the courtroom. Despite knowing this outcome was coming, hearing her admission aloud carried a power all its own. David's hand found mine, squeezing briefly, not for comfort, but in acknowledgement of truth finally spoken. The prosecutor, a sharp-minded woman named Diane Lawrence, outlined the terms of the plea agreement. 2 years imprisonment for the assault on me, 3 for financial fraud, and 5 for the attempted murder conspiracy to be served consecutively. The charges from Florida and Arizona would be handled separately, adding potentially decades more to her sentence. What struck me most as the details unfolded was Elaine's utter stillness. No reactions, no visible emotion, no glances toward David or me. She might have been attending someone else's hearing, observing a stranger's fate being decided. Judge Brennan reviewed the evidence summary, the financial records, the storage unit contents, the toxicology tests, confirming David had indeed been drugged with alprazolam over an extended period. With each damning piece of information, I watched for some crack in Elaine's composure, some hint of the human being behind the calculated facade. None came. The court accepts the defendant's plea of guilty, Judge Brennan declared finally. Mrs. Porter, you are hereby sentenced to 10 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Restitution amounts will be determined at a separate hearing. As the officers approached to escort her away, Elaine turned suddenly toward us. Her eyes, those same eyes that had glared at me over the dinner table that fateful night, locked onto David's. I'm sorry for everything, David. The words fell flat, rehearsed like lines from a play she'd grown tired of performing. David held her gaze without flinching, without speaking. In his silence lay more dignity than any response could have conveyed. After a moment he simply looked away, denying her even the satisfaction of his anger. In the hallway afterward, David released my hand and took a deep breath that seemed to come from somewhere new inside him. I thought it would be harder seeing her like that, hearing her speak. He straightened his tie with steady fingers. But I felt nothing. No hatred, no love, no regret. Just nothing. The emotional amputation was complete. Sometimes the absence of feeling was its own kind of healing. Victoria met us by the elevators, professional as always, but with a genuine smile. You both did wonderfully. This outcome is the best we could have hoped for. It doesn't feel like a victory, I admitted. More like the end of a long illness. You're relieved it's over, but too exhausted to celebrate. David nodded. Exactly. I don't feel like celebrating. I just want to move forward. Moving forward had become our mantra in the months since the storage unit discovery. David had followed through on accepting the veterinary position in Worcester, and after much consideration, I had decided to sell my Boston home. The memories it held, both good and terrible, had begun to feel like anchors rather than foundations. We stepped outside into the September sunshine, the courthouse steps busy with the usual flow of justice being sought and dispensed. For the first time in months, I felt a weight lifting. Not completely, some burdens leave permanent imprints, but enough to stand straighter, breathe deeper. Let's get lunch, David suggested. I'm actually hungry. A small thing, but significant. His appetite had been one of the casualties of Elaine's betrayal. This simple desire for food represented another step in his recovery, another piece of himself reclaimed. We chose a small cafe several blocks from the courthouse, away from the legal professionals and their hurried conversations about cases and clients. David ordered a sandwich and soup. I chose a salad. Normal things, ordinary choices, the kind that form the scaffolding of a life rebuilt. I signed the lease on the Worcester apartment yesterday, he mentioned between bites. It's close to the veterinary hospital, has decent light for houseplants, and allows dogs. Dogs, are you thinking of getting one? He smiled slightly. Maybe. The therapist suggested it might be good for me, responsibility without complexity, unconditional affection without risk. Plus, it's basically a job requirement for a veterinarian to have at least one pet, isn't it? The gentle humor was another returning piece of the David I knew. Not unchanged, none of us could be after what had happened, but recognizable, essential. And what about you? He asked. Any progress on your house hunting? I hadn't told him yet, wanting to be certain before sharing the news. Actually, I've made an offer on a townhouse in Worcester, not too close to your place. I smiled to soften the words, but in the same city. It's smaller than my current home, which feels right. Less to maintain, fewer empty rooms. Surprise flickered across his face, followed by genuine pleasure. That's fantastic, Mom. When do you find out if they accept? The realtor thinks we'll hear by tomorrow. It's a fair offer in a good market, so I'm optimistic. As we continued our lunch discussing practical matters of moving companies and furniture arrangements, I marveled at how ordinary moments can feel extraordinary after trauma. This simple meal, this straightforward conversation, they represented a victory more meaningful than any courtroom decision. The following week brought a flurry of activity as both our real estate transactions progressed. My Boston home sold quickly, purchased by a young family with 3 children who would fill its rooms with new life and laughter. I found myself oddly comforted by this thought as I packed boxes in my bedroom, sorting through decades of accumulated possessions. Some items were easy to categorize: keep, donate, discard. Others carried more complicated emotional weight. Richard's collection of vintage fountain pens, the robe I'd worn as a judge, David's childhood artwork preserved in folders and boxes. Each required its own moment of reflection, its own decision about whether it belonged in my future or solely in my past. In the midst of this sorting, I discovered a leather-bound journal I'd kept during my first years on the bench. Opening it randomly, I found an entry from shortly after a difficult case involving domestic violence. "Justice without compassion becomes mere punishment," I had written. But compassion without justice is merely sentiment. The balance between them, that narrow path, is what I seek each day. Those words, written by a younger version of myself, resonated with unexpected power. The balance between justice and compassion had defined my professional life. Now it defined my personal one as well. Justice for what Elaine had done, compassion for David and myself as we healed, even perhaps a measured understanding of whatever brokenness had created Elaine's capacity for such calculated cruelty. I placed the journal in my keep box. The day before the moving trucks were scheduled to arrive, Victoria called with unexpected news. "Margaret, there's been a development in the case. Elaine has written you a letter from prison. The prosecutor's office intercepted it during routine screening and wanted to know if you're willing to receive it." A chill ran through me despite the warm October afternoon. What does it say? They didn't share the contents, only that it passed their security screening and doesn't contain any threats. You're under no obligation to read it. My immediate instinct was refusal. What could Elaine possibly say that would matter now? Yet curiosity, the same quality that had made me an effective judge, flickered persistently. "I'll read it," I decided. "Have them forward it to my new address after the move." Victoria promised to arrange it, her tone carefully neutral. "How's the packing going?" "Nearly finished. It's strange how a life can fit into cardboard boxes when necessary." "And David he's already settled in Worcester, starting his new position next week. He seems lighter there, as if the geographical distance from Boston has created emotional distance as well." After we hung up, I wandered through the half-empty rooms of my home, touching door frames and windowsills in a kind of silent farewell. 34 years in this house. Richard and I had moved in just before David was born, eager for space and a yard anticipating a future of family dinners and holiday gatherings. That future had materialized, though differently than we'd imagined. Now I was closing this chapter alone. The grandfather clock in the living room, the last major item not yet packed, chimed 5 times. I'd arranged for a specialized moving company to transport it separately, ensuring its delicate mechanisms wouldn't be damaged. Some continuity would travel with me to Worcester, some tangible connection to all that had been. The moving day passed in a blur of logistics and last-minute decisions. By evening, I stood in my new townhouse, surrounded by boxes and disassembled furniture, exhausted but satisfied. The space felt right, neither too large nor too small, with a small garden in the back where I could plant new magnolias come spring. David arrived with takeout dinner and a bottle of wine. We ate sitting on unpacked boxes, using paper plates and plastic utensils, laughing at the makeshift nature of the meal. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his plastic cup of wine in a toast. "To new beginnings," I echoed, "and to carrying forward what matters." We spent the evening unpacking essential items, making my bed, setting up the coffee maker for morning, arranging books on shelves. As David hung photographs in the living room, I noticed he'd included several of Richard. Small acknowledgments of continuity amid change. Before leaving, he handed me a small wrapped package. "A housewarming gift. Open it tomorrow when you have your first morning coffee here." After he left, the townhouse fell quiet, a different quality of silence than my Boston home had held. Less echoey, less haunted by history. I slept deeply that first night, without the hypervigilance that had characterized my rest since the assault. The next morning, I made coffee and unwrapped David's gift at my new kitchen table. Inside was a small crystal figurine of a magnolia blossom, exquisitely detailed and catching the morning light. Beneath it lay a note in David's handwriting: "Some things break so that stronger things can grow. Love, David." Tears came then, not of sadness, but of recognition. My son had not just survived Elaine's betrayal. He had metabolized it into wisdom, the greatest gift a parent could witness. The letter from Elaine arrived a week later, forwarded by Victoria's office in a larger envelope with a note advising me I was still under no obligation to read it. I set it aside, focusing instead on settling into my new home and community. Worcester was different from Boston, smaller, less hectic, with its own distinct character. I found a book club at the local library, joined a walking group for seniors, and even accepted an invitation to speak at the law school about my judicial career. Life was taking shape around me in ways both planned and surprising. David flourished in his new position at the veterinary hospital, specializing in exotic animals as he'd hoped. He adopted a 3-legged rescue dog named Cooper, who quickly became his shadow. We established a routine of Sunday dinners alternating between our homes, careful to maintain both connection and independence. It was after one such dinner, nearly a month after the move, that I finally opened Elaine's letter. David had gone home, and I sat in my small study with a glass of wine, feeling secure enough to face whatever words she had written. The handwriting was neat and controlled, much like Elaine herself had appeared in court. The letter was brief, only a page long. Judge Sullivan. It began the formal address, seeming to acknowledge our true relationship more than mother-in-law would have. I recognize that nothing I can say will undo what I have done to your family. I do not seek forgiveness, as I understand that some actions place one beyond that grace. What I do wish to convey is that you were right to trust your instincts about me from the beginning. You saw what David could not. Had I succeeded in my plan, other families would have suffered as yours has. Your intervention saved not only your son, but future victims as well. The psychologists here have diagnosed me with several conditions that supposedly explain my behavior, but explanations are not excuses. I chose my actions at every step. There is one truth I want you to know: I did not always lie to David. When I told him I admired his kindness, his gentleness with animals and people, I meant it. Those qualities made him an ideal target, yes, but they also made him different from anyone I had known. In another life, with another version of myself, perhaps that would have mattered more. I will serve my sentence and face whatever justice awaits me in Florida and Arizona afterward. I expect to spend the remainder of my life in prison, which is appropriate for the harm I've caused. You were a formidable opponent, Judge Sullivan. In all my years of manipulation and deception, you were the first person I couldn't fool or intimidate. Remember that strength. It saved your son's life. Elaine Porter, formerly Rachel Sullivan. I read the letter twice, searching for manipulation or hidden threats, finding none that I could discern. It offered no dramatic revelations, no excuses, no pleas for leniency. It was perhaps the most honest communication Elaine had ever directed toward me. I didn't show the letter to David. Some burdens need not be shared, and he had already begun building a life without Elaine's shadow looming over every thought. Instead, I filed it away in a drawer, another piece of evidence in a case now closed. November brought cooler weather and preparations for the holiday season. David invited me to join him at the community center, where he'd been attending his support group for survivors of relationship fraud. They were organizing a Thanksgiving dinner for members who might otherwise spend the holiday alone. I'm helping coordinate the meal, he explained, but I'd appreciate your help with the logistics if you're willing. These people have become important to me. The community center gym had been transformed with long tables, autumn decorations, and a volunteer-staffed kitchen, preparing traditional Thanksgiving fare. About 30 people attended, men and women of various ages, each carrying invisible scars of betrayal and deception, each choosing to spend the day in communion rather than isolation. David moved among them with natural ease, knowing everyone's names and stories, offering the gentle attentiveness that made him an excellent veterinarian. I helped where needed, arranging tables, serving food, washing dishes, and observed my son in this new context among people who understood his experience without requiring explanations. During the meal, the group's facilitator, a soft-spoken woman named Heather, clinked her glass for attention. Before we dive into this beautiful food, I'd like to continue our tradition of sharing one thing we're grateful for despite our challenging journeys. I'll start. I'm grateful for second chances at trust. The sharing moved around the table: gratitude for newfound clarity, for supportive friends, for professional help, for the simple pleasure of making autonomous decisions after relationships where control had been stripped away. When David's turn came, he looked directly at me across the table. I'm grateful for the people who tell us difficult truths, even when we're not ready to hear them. and for the chance to become stronger at the broken places. My eyes filled with unexpected tears. Hemingway's phrase about becoming stronger at the broken places had been a favorite of Richard's, quoted often during difficult times. David had clearly absorbed it as his own wisdom, carrying forward his father's perspective in the face of his own challenges. When my turn came, I found myself speaking from a place of surprising rawness. I'm grateful for justice that doesn't erase pain, but helps us carry it more evenly, and for the privilege of watching courage unfold in those we love. After dinner, as we helped clean up, a middle-aged man approached me. "You're David's mother, right?" "The Judge Bong," I nodded, wiping my hands on a dish towel. "Retired now, but yes. I just wanted to say thank you." His voice lowered slightly. "David shared some of your story with me when I first joined the group. Hearing how you handled what happened, it helped me find the courage to press charges in my own case. My financial advisor, also my fiancé, had been systematically draining my accounts for years." The conversation continued briefly, this stranger sharing his story of betrayal and recovery with the ease of someone who has learned that shame belongs to perpetrators, not victims. I listened with the same attentiveness I'd once given to those in my courtroom, honoring his experience with my full presence. As David and I drove home later that evening, the car warm against the November chill, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected community that had emerged from tragedy. "Your support group seems like good people." "They are." David kept his eyes on the road, but a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "We're actually discussing turning it into something more formal. A non-profit organization to help others identify and recover from similar situations." "A non-profit? That's a significant undertaking." "I know, but there's such a need, Mom. So many people suffer in silence because they're embarrassed, because they blame themselves for not seeing the warning signs. We could provide resources, legal guidance, emotional support. A roadmap for rebuilding." The passion in his voice was unmistakable, not the feverish intensity of someone running from pain, but the measured determination of someone transforming it into purpose. "I think that's a wonderful idea," I said carefully. "What would you need to get started?" He glanced at me quickly before returning his attention to the road. "We'd need legal expertise for the incorporation process. Maybe connections to law enforcement and victim services. The kinds of things a retired judge might have access to." The invitation in his words was clear, offering me a role in this new venture if I wanted one. Not as David's mother, but as a professional with relevant skills and experience. "I might know someone who could help with that," I replied, matching his casual tone, while my heart swelled with unexpected joy. December arrived with snow and holiday preparations. David and I established new traditions in our new city, a tree lighting ceremony in the town square, hot chocolate at a cafe near his clinic, and evening volunteering at the animal shelter where Cooper had been rescued. Small pleasures deliberately chosen rather than inherited. The nonprofit idea gained momentum. We drafted mission statements and bylaws, researched similar organizations to identify gaps our group could fill, reached out to potential board members with relevant expertise. David's support group embraced the concept enthusiastically, many volunteering to share their stories as part of educational outreach. We decided to name the organization Phoenix Recovery, symbolizing rebirth from the ashes of betrayal. My living room became our unofficial headquarters, scattered with legal pads and laptop computers, as we built something meaningful from our collective trauma. A week before Christmas, Victoria called with unexpected news. "Martin Kaufman's autopsy results are back. He was poisoned with a substance called thallium, nearly undetectable without specific testing. They've added first-degree murder charges in Florida." The information should have been shocking, but somehow it wasn't. The woman who had sat at my dining table, thrown a glass at my face, and planned to kill me for insurance money was certainly capable of murdering a previous husband. The confirmation merely colored in a picture already sketched in our minds. Will they seek the death penalty? I asked, my judicial mind automatically calculating the legal thresholds and jurisdictional questions. "They're considering it. The prosecutor wants to speak with David as part of their decision-making process, understand how he feels about maximum punishment." I relayed this information to David that evening as we worked on Phoenix recovery materials at my dining table. His reaction surprised me. "I don't want them to pursue the death penalty," he said without hesitation. "Not because I have any mercy for Elaine, but because I don't want any part of myself dedicated to vengeance. I've spent too much energy on her already." The wisdom in his response humbled me. In my years on the bench, I'd seen how the pursuit of the harshest punishment often kept victims tethered to their traumatic experiences, unable to fully move forward while waiting for justice to be served. David had intuitively recognized this trap and chosen a different path. Besides, he added, gathering papers into a neat stack. The organization we're building is about recovery and rebuilding, not retribution. I need to embody that principle in my personal choices, too. I called Victoria the next morning to arrange the conversation with the Florida prosecutor, proud to convey my son's thoughtful position. 2 days before Christmas, we received an unexpected gift. A prominent philanthropic foundation, having heard about Phoenix Recovery through one of David's colleagues, expressed interest in providing initial funding for our nonprofit. The grant would allow us to secure office space, develop educational materials, and even hire a part-time coordinator. David called me immediately after receiving the email, his voice vibrating with excitement. "Can you believe it, Mom? This makes everything real. We can actually make this happen." "I never doubted it," I replied truthfully. Not for a moment. We celebrated that evening with takeout Chinese food and sparkling cider, reviewing the foundation's requirements and planning our next steps. As the evening wound down, David grew contemplative, staring into his empty glass. "Do you think Dad would be proud of this? Of how we've handled everything?" The question caught me off guard. Richard had rarely entered our conversations about Elaine or the aftermath, as if David had cordoned off those parts of his life from his memories of his father. Without question, I answered, certainty flowing through me. "Your father believed in making meaning from difficulty. He would see Phoenix Recovery as the perfect expression of that philosophy." David nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about him more lately, wondering what advice he would have given me about Rachel, about Elaine, I mean." He corrected himself, still occasionally slipping into using the name of the woman he'd thought he married. "He would have trusted you to find your way," I said, "just as I did even when I was worried. That's the balance of parenting adult children, offering wisdom without imposing it." A comfortable silence settled between us, filled with unspoken understanding. Then David reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box, placing it on the table between us. "Merry Christmas a few days early. I wanted to give this to you privately." Inside the box lay a necklace, a simple silver chain supporting a pendant shaped like a gavel. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the gavel perfectly proportioned and detailed. "Turn it over," David urged gently. Engraved on the back was a single sentence, "Justice begins with truth spoken." "It's beautiful," I whispered, genuinely moved by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "Thank you. It's to remind you that your first act of justice wasn't in a courtroom, it was at our dinner table when you refused to accept disrespect and dishonesty. Everything good that's happened since, including Phoenix Recovery, began with that moment." I fastened the necklace around my neck, feeling its weight settle against my collarbone like a badge of honor. "I have something for you too, though it can't match this." My gift to David was practical by comparison, a leather portfolio embossed with Phoenix Recovery, and his name containing a fountain pen from Richard's collection. "Your father would want you to have this for signing all those important nonprofit documents in your future." He ran his fingers over the embossing, then the pen connecting to both his future and his past in a single moment. "It's perfect, Mom. Thank you." Christmas Day itself was quiet, a morning exchange of presents with David and Cooper, an afternoon meal with a few neighbors I'd befriended since moving to Worcester. The holiday held different rhythms than in years past, but comfortable ones nonetheless. As David prepared to leave that evening, Cooper already dozing in the back seat of his car, he hesitated on my front step. "I've been invited to speak at a statewide conference on relationship fraud and recovery next month. Would you consider joining me? Maybe talking about the legal aspects of what happened, how evidence collection made a difference." The invitation represented another threshold, crossed a willingness to share our story publicly, to transform private pain into public education. "I'd be honored," I replied, truly meaning it. January brought heavy snow and rapid progress on Phoenix Recovery. The grant funding arrived, office space was secured, and board members committed their time and expertise. What had begun as an idea born from trauma was blossoming into a structured organization with real potential for impact. The conference David had mentioned was scheduled for the third weekend of the month at a hotel in downtown Worcester. As it approached, we prepared our presentations, carefully conscious of balancing personal narrative with practical information that attendees could apply to their own situations. On the morning of the conference, I watched David dress in a professional blue suit, his hair neatly tied back, his posture straight and confident. Gone was any trace of the shattered man who had stood in my kitchen months earlier, defending a woman who had systematically betrayed him. In his place stood someone new, not unmarked by experience, but strengthened by it. The conference room filled quickly with survivors, advocates, legal professionals, and law enforcement. When David stepped to the podium, the audience fell silent, attentive to his calm presence. "My name is David Sullivan," he began, voice steady and clear. "And today I'm going to share how a broken glass of wine saved my life." For 40 minutes he held the room spellbound, alternating between vulnerable personal narrative and precise analysis of the warning signs he'd missed. He concluded with a call for more education, better legal protections, and greater awareness of financial abuse as a form of domestic violence. The standing ovation when he finished lasted several minutes. I watched from the side of the stage, tears blurring my vision, overwhelmed with pride for this remarkable man who happened to be my son. My own presentation followed a technical overview of evidence collection and legal processes that victims could initiate, but I began with a more personal note. When I was a judge, I often told juries that evidence reveals truth that emotion might obscure. What I didn't fully appreciate until recently was how that principle applies outside the courtroom as well. The broken glass that cut my temple that night revealed a truth I'd sensed but couldn't prove, that something dangerous had entered our home disguised as love. Afterward, as we mingled with attendees during the reception, a woman approached David. She introduced herself as the representative of another foundation interested in supporting Phoenix recovery. "Your presentation was extraordinary," she said, handing him her business card. "I'd like to discuss the possibility of funding to expand your work to rural areas where resources for victims are particularly scarce." David looked at me, his eyes wide with surprise and hope. I nodded encouragingly, feeling the future expanding before us in unexpected ways. That evening, as we drove back to my townhouse, David seemed to be floating with excitement. "Can you believe it? 2 foundations interested in funding us. We could create materials in different languages, develop a secure app for documenting abuse, maybe even open satellite offices in underserved communities." "You've earned this success," I told him, meaning every word. "You've transformed something tragic into something transformative." He pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine, but made no move to exit the car. "None of this would have been possible without you, Mom. Without your courage that night, your persistence afterward, your support throughout this entire process." I reached across the center console and squeezed his hand. "You always had this strength inside you, David. You just needed to rediscover it." As he drove away, leaving me at my door with a promise to call tomorrow, I felt an overwhelming sense of completion. Not in ending our work with Phoenix Recovery was just beginning, but the closing of the painful chapter that had begun with a shattered wine glass. That night I sat on my back porch, despite the January chill, wrapped in a thick blanket, watching stars appear in the clear winter sky. The pendant David had given me rested against my chest, a tangible reminder of justice served and healing begun. The broken glass had shattered more than crystal that night. It had broken the power Elaine had over David, the lies that had built their relationship, the illusion that abuse only happens to other people. In its place, we had built something new and stronger, a renewed bond between mother and son, a shared purpose of transforming traumatic experience into hope for others. I sipped hot tea from a delicate porcelain cup, appreciating its intact rim, its perfect wholeness. Sometimes we need to break completely to rebuild ourselves stronger, like that crystal glass our family had shattered momentarily. But what we built from the fragments was more resilient, more authentic, and infinitely more precious than what we had before. The stars continued their ancient patterns overhead, unchanged by our human dramas, yet somehow witnessing them all the same. I raised my teacup in a silent toast to the universe that breaks things only to create space for something better to emerge.